All right, we've started recording. You might have gotten a little pop-up notification on your screen to consent to the recording. So thank you for joining us this afternoon for a panel as part of the CVPR VizWiz Grand Challenge workshop. My name is Meredith Ringel Morris, and I'm one of the workshop co-organizers. And today we are really lucky to get to speak with our panelists, who are all technology experts and advocates, who are also blind and have a lot of insight into the needs and desires of the blind community with respect to image labeling technology. So I would like each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly in turn, and we'll start with Chancey.
Hi, my name is Chancey Fleet. I am the Assistive Technology Coordinator at the New York Public Library. So I'm basically a technology educator. I work with folks with all types of disabilities, and that includes a lot of computer vision and visual interpreter work. And I just wrapped up a fellowship last year with Data and Society Research Institute, where I did direct advocacy, writing, and presenting for a community around the intersection of data ethics and cloud-connected accessibility tools.
Thanks, and thanks so much for joining us today, Chancey. Next, I'd like Venkatesh to introduce himself.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Venkatesh Potluri. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Washington, and my research focus is to improve accessibility of programming tools to software developers who are blind or visually impaired, and to also improve screen reader interaction efficiency. And I've recently been awarded the Google Lime Scholarship, and in my spare time, I also work on initiatives that help improve STEM education and opportunities for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Venkatesh. And finally, I'd like to introduce Cindy Bennett. Cindy, could you give a brief background?
Yeah, sure. So I am a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University in their Human-Computer Interaction Institute, and my training was in human-computer interaction for my doctoral program. I am an accessibility researcher who also focuses on disability studies, which is a kind of a branch of critical theory that looks at the way, for me specifically, the way technology kind of makes an impact in the world in terms of how people with disabilities are understood. And so I also love photos and social media, so this topic is just interesting to me personally.
Great, thank you. So the first question I'd like to give to the panel, and also just as a note for the audience, I have prepared questions, but if the audience has additional questions they'd like to ask, you can use the chat feature to type your questions, and then I'll mix those questions in with what I ask to the panel. So to start off, I was wondering if each of the panelists could describe what technologies you currently use that provide automated image descriptions, and talk about how these image descriptions impact your experiences in various aspects of your professional and personal lives. So let's start with Cindy.
Sure. So I do want to kind of give a nod to the VizWiz Grand Challenge. I used to use VizWiz when it was an app. So there's kind of some of the ways that research can and has made an impact in the lives, the kind of everyday lives of blind people. I remember submitting images, and at the time there'd kind of be like a delayed response. And now we have kind of technology that goes faster. So I use apps like Facebook provides automatic image descriptions, which kind of provide keywords, and so they're kind of okay. They might help give me a little bit of information about the image, but there's a lot to be desired there. I use an app called Seeing AI, which is produced by Microsoft and is free for all users. And that's particularly helpful for me when I'm trying to read small amounts of text. So there's an OCR feature that for me works really well, and things like recognizing currency. I think those are like the most common apps I use that are automated image descriptions.
Great, thank you. Chancey, would you like to answer as well?
Sure. So I use all the same ones that Cindy uses. So I wouldn't say that I really use the automated image descriptions on Facebook, because unfortunately they're usually too vague to feel useful to me. but I definitely use Seeing AI. And within Seeing AI, I love the short text function so that I can rapidly sort through supplies, anything from like boxes of 3D printing filament to the spices in my kitchen. I really benefit from rapid local text detection, and I really benefit from currency identification. I also use a lot of human in the loop systems. So I use Ira and Be My Eyes, and I want to give a little bit of a shout out to Be Specular, which I feel like is a lesser known and I think really intriguing human in the loop system. Basically, you can send an image and you can ask a question like VizWiz, but you get responses from 5 or 6 different people. So if I want to know about something that is subjective, it might be a photo that I care a lot about. It might be about an item of clothing that I'm going to accessorize. Could be any kind of a scene. Hearing from 5 or 6 different individuals from different places, different walks of life, really helps me kind of build a gestalt and decide what I think about the image without tying myself to any one person's subjective opinion.
Thanks. And Venkatesh, what about you?
Yes, so in terms of automatic image description tools, I use much of the stuff that Cindy and mentioned. In addition to Facebook, so there's Seeing AI, which is a big part of my automatic image description tasks are being served by, and also the iOS has integrated automatic image descriptions to some extent. So if you're on a web page with an image, it tries to generate a caption for that. And even in Facebook, yeah, as Cindy and Chansey were mentioning, yes, there is some level of data, that information that's being provided. But yes, it sometimes gives me enough context to know whether I want to look at this post more or just scroll through. But beyond that, I don't know. And it's good for getting images which have a lot of text in it. So it seems to be doing good with that. Seeing AI, the thing that I love the most about Seeing AI is the ability to share pictures from messaging apps like WhatsApp. So a huge part of my social communication happens on WhatsApp. So when people send images, I just share it to see if I just can get, if I want to ask more questions about the image, or if I'm getting enough context to respond to that, the conversation which has an image, or if I just, want to ignore the whole conversation. Just And in terms of professional scenarios, yes, image descriptions do, are a big part of getting information, because a lot of times you have emails where there are screenshots with flyers and, other kinds of critical information, which is, embedded in an image. So it's either, yes, again, trying to, recognize it with Seeing AI, and either you want to follow up or you get enough information for me to go and Google search for what the whole thing is about. So yeah, that's my image description, automatic image description use cases in a nutshell.
Thanks. And so following on to that, the next question is, based on your experiences with these kinds of technologies, do you have suggestions for the computer vision community about how to make automated image description technologies better meet the needs of people who are blind? And related to that, I'd like you to also consider a question from an audience member, which is around, does having multiple different AI captions for the same image, would that be one of the options that you might find more helpful? Cindy, would you like to respond to this question first?
Sure. So a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is AI and fairness. And so I think one thing that I try to advocate is I think there's a lot of push around describing appearance of people in images, and I just want to push for caution in that, in the ways be thinking about how we're teaching AI to describe images and who will have what impact from that. And so I think often we might hear oh, I want to understand information about people's appearance, but that put harmful impact on like the LGBT community if we don't recognize like non-binary genders or you know, people who have darker skin. So kind of thinking the balance, these preferences maybe that screen reader users give, and making sure that those preferences are from like a really diverse audience. And so for me, actually, what would make descriptions better is if we proceed in ways of like maybe trying to make smaller steps, but really like high quality and accurate steps. And so thinking about like learning the information in screenshots, I feel like is a very, could be potentially an interesting problem to look at without maybe kind of harming people by trying to describe their appearance. And so like, I just think of like isolating problems, trying to scope problems and improve on maybe identifying particular things or types of images, you know, rather than trying to make AI like a panacea for image descriptions.
Thanks, Cindy. Chancey, did you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, I kind of want to echo and expand on what Cindy has said specifically regarding facial recognition, especially since we're at this moment in time where IBM and Google and Amazon have taken some steps to limit their work on facial recognition during this climate that we're in, and I'm glad that they have. Earlier, I watched one of the presentations, and the presenter was telling some kind of fun stories about the use of facial recognition. One of them, allegedly a professor, was keeping tabs on students coming in late into the classroom, and another one, allegedly a salesman who was blind, was analyzing the person he was pitching to using facial recognition. And I worry that the beneficence that kind of surrounds accessibility technology, this idea we have that accessibility is always a universal good, has created a situation where blind people and our perceived needs can be used to normalize facial recognition in private and semi-private spaces. And I will tell you, as a library worker who cares about patron privacy, and as someone who doesn't want to contribute in any way to like building of more facial recognition databases that might not always be local, that might be connected to other uses in the cloud, I really don't want to be part of a group that pushes and normalizes facial recognition. And I think the action item that you can take away from that, if you're a developer or a researcher, is to really think about intersectionality, think about the fact that what you're building might not always be used only for the use that you intend, that you are not the sole owner of the legacy that your technology leaves behind, and you have to be really careful how you operationalize things. And also talk to blind people about our priorities, because I think for most of us, we don't deploy facial recognition in our personal and professional lives as much as marketing material would have you think that we do. I was so glad to hear that Seeing AI uses local only facial recognition today. I didn't know that, and that set my mind at ease a little bit. And I would just encourage more broadly to balance accessibility needs and privacy needs as machine learning databases get stronger and processing power continues to increase. When you have a choice of whether to make something cloud connected or make it local so that security and privacy issues can be, if not eliminated, at least harm can be reduced.
Thanks, Chancey. Venkatesh, would you like to add something?
Yes. So yes, I resonate with a lot of what Cindy and Chancey just mentioned about, especially about the privacy implications of facial recognition. And I definitely would not feel good about being basically being projected as, oh, people who are blind or visually impaired would need facial recognition. So, that shouldn't be a way of pushing facial recognition into everyday use. And the other thing that I really want, everybody to think about is how can we, so image captions as they stand today, to me, look like a very one-way communication, is that there's an image that's being captioned, and yes, users can, read the caption. But there's more to images and there's more to captions is what I think, right? So one thing is it would be nice to incorporate feedback, like is the user happy with the caption or is the user wanting more information? And this kind of connects to one of the questions that Mary was mentioning about an audience member asked around would more than one captions help, right? Like maybe, because if a user is not happy with one caption, is there a way to get an alternative? Like Bispecular, as Jancy was mentioning, if I understand correct, does something like that. The other thing is with captions is personalization. So this again, I would like rate privacy over this because personalization is very nuanced. There are probably certain expressions that, for example, my people in my close circle, say close friends or family, use visual expressions use, and this may or may not be captured by a generalized image image captioning algorithm. So how can these captions be personalized to convey nuances like that? And also at the same time, how can these nuances just stay to the user and not be generalized, right? Like not go everywhere. Finally, the other thing to keep in mind is also bystanders. So when thinking about image captioning and thinking about scenarios, it's also important to think about bystanders who may or may not have the option to, give explicit consent on, the image captioning systems that they're being part of, whether the images are being shared or not. So again, maybe there's scope for doing more anonymization, like anonymizing the people or any kinds of PII. Maybe there's more work to it. So yeah, these are some of the things that come to my mind when we think about image captioning and what can be better.
Thanks. And just to mention again, since some of our audience members joined in after we began, if the audience members have questions they'd like me to ask, please put them into the chat window and I'll weave those in. Moving on, the next question I had is whether any of you use human-in-the-loop image description technologies, such as visual interpreter services. I know, for example, Chancey earlier mentioned using some of those. And more generally, what do you see as the pros and cons of human-in-the-loop versus fully automated image description approaches? Chancey, do you want to start?
Sorry, did you call on me? My Zoom chose that moment to just freeze
Same.
out.
Yes,
Hear what you
Chancey,
said
it's your
towards the
turn.
end.
Chancey, it's your turn to speak.
Oh no.
Oh, it looks like
Mary?
Chancey froze, so we'll
Oh
let.
no, I thought you froze. I'm sorry, I'm good, I'm here.
Oh, great.
Thank you for that. Always one time in every Zoom. So I think that human-in-the-loop technologies have some cons, some security concerns associated with them. So, for example, the data that we expose to human-in-the-loop services could be used by individuals. In theory, could compromise our security, and it's also important to look at human-in-the-loop service privacy policies, just as it is with computer vision. I think the other kind of drawback of human-in-the-loop services is that you don't have quite the same efficiency. It takes a while to explain to a human being what you want to do, and there's going to be some connection time and some wait time. So for very simple things like color detection or text recognition or currency recognition, I think that computer vision is advanced enough now to take care of most of those things. Where I think human-in-the-loop services really shine is when the task at hand is action-oriented. So for example, I do origami videos and they are full of movement and full of action, and all of that needs to be interpreted, and it's fast-moving and complex. And I haven't seen computer vision do as well with moving images as it can with even stationary images. And I think the other place where human-in-the-loop services are really essential, and I believe will be essential for quite some time to come, is when the content is subjective, when there's valence there, when there are things that would stand out as important because they're cultural markers or because of aesthetics. it's really hard. I won't say that it'll never happen, but it's really hard to accomplish interpretation of something that's of artistic or cultural import with computer vision or with machine learning, I think.
Thanks. Venkatesh, would you like to respond as well?
Yes. Yeah, so in terms of human-in-the-loop services, I've used Ira and Be My Eyes. These are two of the services that I've had some experience with. One is a paid service and the other is volunteer-driven. So yes, there are pros and cons with human-in-the-loop, services. And I echo my sentiments with a lot of what Chancy said around, what are the privacy policies of these systems, and also, if this can be, if the data that you're sharing is essentially being received by a human. So yes, even if a privacy policy said that, yes, we are kind of
Oh, Venkatesh, we lost your audio, I think. Or maybe it's just my Zoom that's crashed.
correct.
Oh, now we can hear you again.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so the other thing that I like about human-in-the-loop services is, personally, I find that there's a lot of scope for getting additional information. Like, there is probably a specific thing that I'm trying to look for in an image that may not be very obvious to anybody in one go, right? So there's possibility to have a dialogue and get more context around image, contains and what I want from the image. Similarly, yes, importance like timely relevance and cultural importance. These are some of the things that are currently conveyed by humans. And yes, fast-paced actions. And yeah, so the other, while all of this is good, I do think that automated image description services offer a level of discreteness over human-in-the-loop image description services. Like, I don't want probably to, for people around me to notice that, I'm using a human-in-the-loop or I'm using an image description service all the time. And when there is a dialogue, be it voice or text, some of these human-in-the-loop services support communication via text. There is a certain level of observation that, oh, this person is using a human-in-the-loop service or an image description service. I sometimes prefer that this is more discreet, like not very obvious. Yeah, thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Of course. Go ahead, Chancy. Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting to me, Venkatesh, that you feel that way. And I think I felt that way when I first started using human-in-the-loop services. But over time, my perspective has changed. And now I just say to people who are around me, oh, I have an interpreter. And my thinking has really evolved to make room in my life for that person who is a professional. And I think one of the things that we want to be careful of, even as we empower people that are working or volunteering for these human-in-the-loop services, we can use computer vision to speed things up for them, to provide them with contextual information. And I think that's all to the good. But, deaf and deaf-blind people have had interpreters for a long time. Most of us as blind people have not had someone we would identify as a visual interpreter until the advent of these services. And I think it's that emerging genre of work and micro-volunteering is so new that I really find it important to make space for the fact that it is a skilled act of labor and in some cases a profession. And I'm at a point where I want that person, I don't want that person to be centered, but I want that person to be acknowledged and
Sorry, I think things.
I agree with what you're saying. And yes, there are some scenarios where I would really not want a machine to kind of describe things to me. If I were at a waterfall, a beautiful looking soundscape, right? To give a very simple example, I don't currently trust that, or now or anytime in the near future, an automated algorithm to fully capture the nuance of how wonderful that thing is. And that is a human skill. And yeah, I agree with you, Chansey, in that I appreciate that skill too.
Yeah, so to follow up, I use both Ira and I use Be My Eyes. And a couple of notes. I think one thing I like to think about is kind of the wider cultural context. I think both Chansey and Venkatesh have mentioned, but I'm an academic, right? So like, yes, and something that's concerning to me is like when Ira markets itself as a way to access life, like I don't want to diminish the ways that we're all kind of interdependent in the role that humans play in helping each other. I think as a society, we could do more to acknowledge that. But at the same time, this and like AI accessibility can't be used as an excuse. So for example, like for a workplace, you know, maybe choosing a proprietary system that's not accessible to me, like these systems like IRA are not excuses to continue those practices. And similarly, I've seen IRA marketed as a tool for helping someone maintain like a social distance. And while I'm grateful for that type of assistance, I also think it's important for the general community to maintain an awareness that not everyone is having the same life experience, and we need to be nuanced in our understanding of like how can the general public play a role in like respectfully helping a blind person maybe keep a social distance so that we don't have to rely on IRA or whatever. So thinking in that wider cultural context, and to that point, I think as researchers and academics, one thing we can do to try to change the game is often we're incentivized to argue that our novel technology is like a panacea and is universally good. And I think really what we can do as particular reviewers of papers is recognize when there's like a relatively narrowly scoped contribution, but that works really well. So like as an example, you know, I might still be living under a rock, but I don't have an iPhone color identifier app that I trust as much as my standalone color identifier device. And I don't have a good way to read screenshots. And those are two like really narrow scope problems that like I feel like AI or computer vision could solve. And if one of you panelists wants to tell me your color identifier app, feel free, but I haven't found a great one.
Did any of the other panelists want to continue to respond to this question, or did you want me to move on to another question? It sounds like people are
hear you.
You can't hear me.
Now, yes.
Sorry, I think I'm having some trouble with Zoom on my end. I don't know if it's because I'm running the recording that might be overloading my system a little bit. There's a question from the audience now, actually. Let me take a look at that. So the question is whether you have preferences between sharing images versus sharing videos to services in order to support learning about visual information. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that topic. Venkatesh, since you're unmuted, would you like to comment first?
I think we need to have someone read the question again.
Yeah, I can go ahead, Mary. I'll go ahead and jump in because I do think that there's some connection issues. Hopefully it'll go better for me. And this was actually my question. This is Donna Garari. Do you have any preference between sharing images versus videos to services to support your learning about visual information around you? And I just threw out there a couple of implications that I was thinking about, which is implications for privacy versus the depth of understanding that is possible for learning about your surroundings. And Venkatesh, it looks like would you like to go first? Looks like you're unmuted.
I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists have to say about this.
Okay.
Cindy, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Chansey, it looks like you're unmuted.
Yeah, it's hard to answer this question because I haven't experienced many instances where computer vision for video has been possible or has yielded results. I would be comfortable using computer vision or a visual interpreter tool, particularly if it were running locally, but maybe even if it were running in the cloud, to interpret elements of my surroundings. And I would especially be comfortable with that if I could use a video stream to scan for certain types of objects. You know, I don't think I need to scan for all kinds of objects. I've seen some use cases for that, but there are a few. Specifically looking for signage would be huge. And short text does it to some extent, but you've got to be pretty well focused. So detecting the edges of what might be signs, I think would be really useful. Finding an empty seat on the train is kind of the perpetual question. I have a guide dog who helps me find them, but they were less easy to find when I used a cane. Or returning to a specific location, like maybe I'm in a large banquet hall and I want to kind of tag and come back to something. If I could use computer vision as an aid to achieve those things, or look for landmarks. If I know I'm supposed to be looking for entrances, steps going to the subway, it would be great if I could look for those things. I wouldn't expect computer vision in the near term to interpret, you know, things with valence like TV, anything dramatic, anything subjective. So I think in the near term, the exciting problems might be in, you know, detecting objects that might need to be generalized.
Cindy, did you have any additional comments on this question?
Oh, no, I think Venkatesh can go.
Oh yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, Dana, it was around sharing videos, or was it more on the lines of video descriptions in general?
So the question was about sharing images and videos, but with that said, I'm happy also to hear about your thoughts about the latter question as well.
About sharing images and videos with, if you're talking about the service that is, you know, providing the audio, providing the description to improve that, it's again a tricky one to think about. On the one hand, we know that more data is probably going to make the models better. It would be nice to have an option to choose when to share and when to not share, the video or the content back to the service or model that is kind of giving you this information. And as for video, I find video streams and descriptions of video streams currently happening through human-in-the-loop services, like mostly IRA, when I'm walking in unfamiliar neighborhoods, especially just, so to speak, unfamiliar neighborhoods. And when you're curious to know about what's around you, like what are the different stores and so on, or like people or signs of alarm that you need to be careful about, right? And the other interesting use case that I would think about for video descriptions is automatically generating audio descriptions for videos to some extent. I was just looking at some ways in which computer vision is now trying to help identify context and actions around what's happening in videos. So it would be really interesting to see down the line if there's an automatic way of generating audio descriptions for videos.
I'd love to just jump in. This is a little off the topic, but it's just the use case I've found. I'm not super familiar if there's good systems available, but something that I think could be really useful for computer vision is if we could work on certain camera apps like the iPhone's camera try to give you feedback on what's like in the image and if it's centered or top left or top right. And I've found that I at least, and I think some other blind people struggle that by the time we hear that feedback, we may have already moved. So helping kind of give like immediate information as soon as the photo has been taken about the quality of the image, or like if we could indicate like there's one person and I want that person to be centered and kind of get some assistance there, I think would be extremely useful.
Thanks. So in the conversation so far, can everyone hear me? I know I've been having some tech difficulty on my end.
You're sounding good now.
I sound good
Yeah.
now. Okay, great. So in the conversation that's come up so far, first we've talked about, I think, what are the two most common scenarios that computer vision researchers are working on right now, which is descriptions of static photographs like you might find on Facebook, and then also descriptions of imagery from the real world, like for actually, interacting with objects in your physical environment. And then in your comments, panelists, you've brought up some other scenarios in which computer vision might be relevant, such as descriptions of videos rather than still photographs. Cindy mentioned color identification. I believe a couple people mentioned optical character recognition for reading text. I was wondering if you had comments on additional scenarios that you think deserve more attention from the computer vision community. So for example, perhaps things like descriptions of non-photorealistic media, or descriptions that are more scientific media, or other kinds of descriptions that would be of value to you. Chancey, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
I have a few, and I'll try to keep it brief. Just to echo what Cindy says about color identifiers, that is a real and legitimate problem. Our standalone color identifiers do a really good job of occluding outside light and providing a neutral light source. And I think that might be why they work better. We have yet to find a really powerful, strong color identifier for mobile that I'm aware of. You really have to use a color identifier for mobile under like ideal conditions. And so that's kind of a perennial problem that I would be excited to see solved. But let me hit real quick three things, three scenarios where I think computer vision could be extremely useful. One of them is interactive touchscreen displays and LCD menus. So we have the ability to read either full documents or short text, but we don't really yet have the ability to either point at something and hear the text under where we're pointing or adjacent to where we're pointing, which means that we have to use human-in-the-loop services to encounter any inaccessible touchscreen. If you think about maybe the touchscreen ordering machines at a place like a Wawa or a Shake Shack, those are all inaccessible. And if we have a stable camera and we have the ability to point, we should be able to localize the detection of text to a point where we can engage and interact with a control, or we should be able to capture the full array of controls and be able to explore it, if you will, in kind of freeze frame to get acquainted with it. And I think that stuff could happen. Then similarly with LCD menus, which item on the LCD menu is highlighted? We don't yet have the ability to detect a highlight. And so even simple LCD controls where the actual controls that we use might be accessible and it's just the display that's not. For example, my Ultimaker 3D printer has an LCD scrollable menu. And if I knew which item was highlighted, I could use it without a human-in-the-loop service, and that would be fantastic. The other thing that I would like to see, so I run a lab in New York City called the Dimensions Project, where we make the means of production for tactile graphics and 3D objects available and accessible to blind and sighted people. And one of the things we struggle with is that you can't just take a typical image that's visual and render it non-visually, because non-visual resolution is way lower. And so we've got to scale up the image. We also have to change textual labels to Braille labels. We also have to replace color with something else like texture. And if the information on the graphic is too dense, we have to declutter it. So for example, a map with lots of different kinds of factors and layers on it, we would separate into several maps, each one containing its own layer of data of information. All of those processes are pretty predictable, and I believe that some of them, in particular, replacing color with texture, doing smart scaling and cropping and detecting text and making it editable and replaceable with Braille text and a Braille font would all be really exciting problems in computer vision that people could immediately put to use in creating their own tactile graphics. One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why blind people don't have better access to tactile graphics and spatial information is that right now you have to have a lot of technical acumen and determination to go grab something on the internet and get it into a format that's accessible to you. It's something that's mostly done by sighted people and mostly done by professionals. And I think this field could really help change that.
Thank you. Cindy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'm actually surprised Chancey didn't bring this up, but I think just our current pandemic is, first of all, I mean, I think we need to be continuing like for human authored image descriptions, like AI currently won't replace a human authored, but something that like an image that's replicated like a zillion times, like the flat and the curve. I think there was kind of some news coverage of which, you know, Chancey contributed to about how like numerous public health organizations were putting out, you know, these graphics to understand what a pandemic is and like why these best practices matter. And so, yes, I think access, you know, it's not just social media images, you know, it's also access to scientific images and for multiple audiences, right? Like there's a different type of way you could describe the image for someone who's an expert versus like the kind of more public health, flatten the curve images that are meant for a general audience. So yes, I think diversifying, I think social media has kind of been a very particularly popular case in the HCI literature where I'm aware of the literature, but there are many, many other education scientific use cases that would be very helpful.
Thank you so much for that. I should have mentioned it. And I think what Cindy's saying also applies to all kinds of STEM diagrams and infographics. There are some things like maps and like schematic circuit diagrams that have a pretty limited taxonomy of symbols. And I think anything that has a limited taxonomy of symbols is ripe for a solution through computer vision.
Thank you. And Venkatesh, would you like to comment?
Yes, so complementing what Chancey and Cindy mentioned, I would say that, you know, visual information is very prevalent in STEM education and STEM documents. So yes, it would be very critical to focus, you know, on making images in the context of technical education. So I'm kind of biased towards computer science because that's where I come from, but there is a lot of computer science literature, and there's like data visualizations, and there's like system diagrams and all sorts of things which are not accessible. And yes, future work, I mean, yes, authors should be doing, you know, their bit to make some, you know, these papers and, you know, these diagrams and figures accessible, but there's also so much literature that we already have which is extremely important and you know, informs how we learn concepts. So that you know, thinking about how can we you know, how can computer vision contribute to making these schematics and these diagrams accessible, again, to emphasize not just to give a piece of information that may be important, but in a way that somebody who's looking at the information can go deep and you know, further get things that the author may or may not wanted to have, you know, may or may not have in mind when they were describing the image, right? Because that's one of the things that makes reading scientific papers easy is what can you get out of it as a reader. So explorability of STEM images, I'd say, is another interesting thing to look at.
Thank you. So for the next question, I wanted to talk about error. In particular, could you describe types of errors that you have personally encountered in automated image descriptions, and what were the consequences to you of these errors? How did you even know that the description was an error? And how do you think automated systems should better handle cases of error? Cindy, would you like to talk first?
Yeah, so this is kind of like the bread and butter of my current passion right now with AI and fairness. So I would say first, in the most like innocuous way, AI has provided humor. So sometimes I'll comment on my friend's Facebook post. They'll have posted something and they've given enough context for me to know that whatever the automatic image description is was totally wrong. So like, I don't remember, somebody had posted like a room with like furniture in it, and I was like, haha, like Facebook thinks this is food. You know, and I'll just do that. But thinking more seriously, I think there's two things. Like, all errors are not created equal. And that's both for blind people and just everyone in general, right? People who have been historically marginalized, like I've been misgendered by seeing AI, but as a cis woman, that doesn't mean the same thing as if a transgender person is misgendered. So thinking about errors in the cultural context as well as, you know, with nuance in that error is not created equal. You know, if OCR can't read something on Facebook, that's a little bit different than if OCR can't read my professional documents that I'm supposed to respond to. And then to that point, I think we also need to think about, and particularly when, I don't want to say that blind people are unaware and are unable to give feedback, but think about the feedback you're getting when someone is not even able to assess whether they're encountering an error. So for a lot of images, there's not enough context to even make a judgment whether the AI is accurate. And if you don't have a human in the loop system, if you don't have enough vision yourself, like me, I'm totally blind, it's going to be really hard for me to assess whether errors are acceptable when a large percentage of the time I can't even tell whether something is inaccurate. So kind of thinking about diversifying the stakeholder feedback you're getting when you're assessing the ethics of things like error, accuracy, and impact.
Thank you. Chancey, would you like to respond?
I think actually Cindy covered a lot of what I would say, and I think I'm going to pass this one on to Venkatesh, if that's okay.
Great. Venkatesh, go for it.
Yeah. So yes, I do agree that not all errors are equal. And I mean, complementing what Cindy said, I had like slightly more embarrassing experiences with, you know, incorrect captions. The most recent one being, so Twitter recently started describing GIFs. So I got excited and replied to that post, wanted to reply to that post with a thumbs up. And one thing that I realized after responding to a thumbs up, a GIF that was described as, you know, having a thumbs up was, oh, there's a lot of possible GIFs that sarcastically maybe meaning a thumbs up, but that's not my intent, right? Like, how do I get this nuance? How do I fix this? Because it is a public forum and I intended no sarcasm and didn't want to, you know, diminish the work that somebody has done. But yeah, so these kinds of errors have happened. And also around, you know, incorrect context about what's in the image, and ended up asking, you know, one might end up asking questions about, oh, so what was that about, right? So yeah, these are the kinds of errors that I personally would, you know, think about when I think about errors in image descriptions and image captions.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes remaining, and I want to make sure to save enough time for some rich discussion around this final question that I prepared, which is that today, most vision to language systems are developed by sighted researchers. And I was hoping that you all could discuss the importance of having blind technology experts participate directly in the research process and how you think this might best be achieved, and also to discuss your thoughts on how CVPR itself could be more inclusive of the blind community. Cindy, would you like to begin?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to keep it brief. So I think, as I mentioned before, I think blind people, or just people with disabilities who have the direct experiences generally, can play a huge role in helping like define the problem. So like during this hour, we've really given a lot of examples that are based on our lived experiences, and certainly they're not what every blind person needs, but they're rooted in kind of a reality, whereas a lot of research might be rooted in assumptions. And so that can be really helpful. And then I think also the story that we tell around technology, people with disabilities can kind of help you craft a narrative that's accurate and respectful. And so, as I mentioned, like IRA marketing itself as a tool for making things accessible, that's great, but that can also come off as you know, maybe even removing some of the agency of blind people in what they do to like also gain access, but also removing some of the responsibility of other people who should be working to make their content accessible. So those are two ways I think it's really crucial.
Thank you. Chancey.
I think that there's a couple of things that need to happen for the culture to shift enough to not only welcome, but actively motivate blind people to come into the STEM professions in general and into the computer vision field in particular. Um, I I love being a technology educator and I love being at the periphery of this field. And I've been fortunate to work with lots of developers and designers and users. And yet there's always an element of tension and pain because our contributions are not always seen as equal. And often the people who are doing research and development want to think of us not as colleagues, but as users, as subjects. And I think people need to become, nobody's in this field because they want to do the wrong thing, but folks need to become way more aware of the implicit biases that they've been taught by our culture and that they're carrying. For example, there was a speaker today that showed a slide and said, you can see this, but if you couldn't, this app would help. And I realized in that moment, oh my gosh, this person does not see me as part of their audience. And there are always moments like that, and they're magnified in academic and professional settings. But where the rubber really hits the road, even if people understand and work to combat their implicit biases, we're slowed down at every turn by inaccessible software and sometimes hardware that doesn't conform to well-known, well-established and understood standards like web content accessibility guidelines. Although I'm really excited about this workshop and I'm so happy to be a part of it, the workshop website has posed some real accessibility roadblocks and barriers that have distracted us a little bit from the substantive work that we'd like to be doing. And I think allies within organizations, within conferences, within whatever profession, when someone notices an accessibility roadblock, a serious error, they need to treat it as seriously as they would treat a problem with fire code or a problem with any other civil right, and just really put down the brakes. Make sure that requests for proposals have clear guidance on what is expected of accessibility performance, and that there are automatically invoked consequences should accessibility fail to perform as advertised in an RFP. And if you're a professor, if you're a teacher, if you are managing interns, designing inaccessible technologies should earn folks a failing grade or a chance to try again. There shouldn't be a situation where our future developers or designers are allowed to code inaccessibly when accessible alternatives exist. And we have to get real about it. We can't just continue to have symposia about it and convene the Allies Club. We've actually got to do it even when not everyone in the room agrees.
Thanks, Chancey. And just to expand on that as context for some of the audience members who may not be aware, this year the CVPR registration website was not accessible to screen reader users. So the many blind speakers in our workshop were not able to register themselves without assistance, which was, of course, a major concern that we raised with the organizers of CVPR. So thank you for addressing that, Chancey. Venkatesh, would you like to comment?
Yes. So I would say, in addition to what Chancey mentioned, right, I think people with disabilities are, experts, and it's important to involve people with disabilities in various stages of the research that we're doing, who may be benefiting and who may be able to contribute to, the work in interesting ways. For this, I think, I'll scope this down to involving, say, people who are blind or visually impaired in the computer vision literature and, the general community. And I would look at, things across the board, from resources for somebody to, get educated and gain the skills. Do we have material that's accessible? Do we have tools that work with screen readers and produce output that is not purely visual? Do we have, artifacts that people can look at, accessibly and kind of contribute to things, right? So for example, if you're thinking about video descriptions, right? And if you're thinking about how do we say, train algorithms to describe actions in videos or describe what exactly is happening in videos, what is the best source to, gain from? Do we create a data set, or do we look at, video description data sets that are available, and how, what kinds of, nuances that we could capture by, looking at the right data, right? For example, one thing that I notice quite often with descriptions or even presentations is the use of verbs which say things like this image or that graph or this, table. If there was a visually impaired person or blind or visually impaired person involved in when this was happening, it would probably not happen, right? It would, those verbs wouldn't enter the description because they're not as nuanced as saying the picture on the top right or the graph on the bottom left. So these kinds of nuances, I think it's hard to just imagine and capture, and involving people with disabilities in all aspects, including like very very professional roles, would definitely help improve the overall quality of the research that we produce.
Thank you so much. I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank all of the panelists, Chansey, Cindy, and Venkatesh, for this discussion. This, again, as a reminder, we have been recording this discussion, so barring any technical difficulties, we plan to be posting it online within the next day or so. I encourage people in the audience who found this discussion informative as I found it, to reshare the link with your colleagues when it becomes public. We'll also be sharing on Twitter the Twitter handles of our speakers in case people would like to continue this discussion further online after the event. So thank you again so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Goodbye.